Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to come and speak. I will kind of lead off this kind of civil society consultation and probably make a mess of it, and then my colleagues will clean up the mess I think that I've made. I'm just going to say a couple of introductory comments about how KAIROS works, and then tell a couple of stories about why we work the way we do, and then finally wrap up. I think I'm going to try and wrap up with some concrete suggestions about moving forward. KAIROS was created to work for peace and justice by 11 Canadian churches and church-based organizations. Our overseas program is informed by the work of 23 funded partners, mostly operating in zones of conflict in the Global South, and dozens of non-funded relationships. We aren't explicitly an MDG organization. In fact, and I was thinking about this morning, based on some of the conversations yesterday, in some ways, you could say that KAIROS is a victim of the MDGs. What do I mean by that? When KAIROS was defunded by the Canadian government 3 years ago, we were defunded. We were defunded for several reasons. Some of them nonsensical, but some of what was said by the government is they don't fund advocacy, they don't fund human rights, they don't fund work on good governance and ecological justice. Those are the things that sit out. If you notice, those are all the things that sit outside the MDGs, and those are all the things that KAIROS worked on. And this is not to argue that our government's international development policy was in any way formed by the MDGs, but I think it was informed at some point along the way by certainly on the work around maternal health and the way that the maternal health initiative was done here. It certainly wasn't offered in a way that KAIROS would do maternal health, if you like. So in some ways, I would say we were a victim of several things, but one, you could argue that we were a victim of the MDGs. For KAIROS, rights are at the heart of international development. What does that mean? That means the way we operate is to try and get to the root causes of problems. And we assert that justice, ecological sustainability, and we work for the creation of viable communities. Just a couple of brief stories about why we work the way we do. On Tuesday this week that passed, a migrant worker from Guatemala came to visit us. His name, you may have read an article in the Star about him. His name was Jose Sicajao. He had been coming to Canada as a migrant worker over a period of 4 years. And in 2006, he intervened. He was working in Canada. He intervened in a dispute between an employer and another Guatemalan migrant worker. The story is that the employer had struck the migrant worker, and a couple of people, including Jose, tried to halt the struggle. So he was expelled from Canada, and he was cut out of the program of the temporary workers agricultural program here in Canada. So here's a guy who did the right thing, but was punished for it. Here's a poor person who came from the hills of Guatemala to work here to better his family's life, and had all of his rights stripped away from him. Upon returning to Guatemala, Jose founded an organization called the Association of Guatemalans United for Our Rights, a community-based NGO. He's also a Maya, which is an important aspect of the story. He's from, let me see if I can get the pronunciation right, My Spanish is a little rusty. Well, and my Mayan is even rustier. Zacatepetez, Guatemala. This important aspect of the story. Guatemalans like Jose migrate to Canada largely because they are poor, obviously. Many Guatemalans are poor because they have no access to lands and resources in their own communities. As is often the case, Guatemalan lands and resources have been sold or leased by the government to private transnational corporations, often Canadian mining firms or US fruit companies, in order to earn income for not only themselves, their political party, or even sometimes the national treasury. These corporations tend to pay very little, if anything, in taxes. We heard a lot about that yesterday, to the host government. And even in some cases, the tax codes are written with consultants paid by CEDA, our development agency, often facilitating investment into communities and lowering tax rates. That is certainly the case of Colombia. Guatemalan farmers are often displaced by these transnational projects. Workers therefore come to Canada to earn income for their families. And interestingly, I didn't know this until I met Jose, but remittances from overseas workers, this is a similar case in the Philippines, right? Remittances from overseas workers have become the largest source of income for the Guatemalan government. And much of this money is used to pay international debts incurred by previous governments to help them achieve development goals at times, sometimes even the MDGs. Much of the what I've said above is particularly true for Indigenous people. Developing countries rely on exporting their people. Developing nations like our own rely on importing them and curtailing their rights. We asked Jose, does the system for temporary workers need changing or does it need ending? The same could be said about our system of development. His community, and this is the point I'm going to make at the end, his community would like the right to say no to development. Second story, over 10 years between 2000 and 2009, KAIROS, with the help of CEDA, when we had CEDA funding, provided over $300,000 to a Palestinian partner, the Near East Council of Churches, to create and run the Shihya Family Health Center in Gaza City. The center provided services to approximately 10,000 families in Gaza City. The clinic's services included tests for malnutrition and anemia, pre- and postnatal care. It had a baby clinic, it had a pharmacy, and it had a mobile dental clinic. On January 10th, 2009, the Near East Council of Churches was contacted by the Israelis that the clinic would be destroyed. 15 minutes later, this is a premeditated action, this is the point. 15 minutes later, the clinic was completely leveled by Israeli warplanes, destroying a church-run clinic and all its valuable medical equipment. It was targeted as part of military operations in Gaza. As we wrote to Lawrence Cannon, the Minister of Foreign Affairs at the time, and we repeated later in the press to anyone who would listen, if we don't challenge the pre-planned bombing of a health clinic serving desperately poor people like the people in Gaza, and the roots of distrust that lead to all forms of violence, the inequality of rights to development, what would justify building another health clinic, regardless of your development rubric? The people of Palestine, like the people of Israel, ought to have the right to their own self-determination. Interestingly, I had a conversation after the bombing of the health clinic with an Israeli friend of mine, and she said to me, and I've heard lots of Israelis say this, we just wish everyone would leave us alone, including, they would say, the US government, and how funding the 4 point whatever billion dollars a year that they fund, that they support the IDF with, is how that is skewing their economy. What can be done? We've been reading a lot about this Oxfam model of development. I don't know if people have mentioned this recently. They call it the donut model, where rights are at the bottom. It's the donut. They describe it as a whole, but I think it's easier to describe as a kind of a series of levels. They describe rights being at the whole. Kind of development is the donut, and then on the outside of the donut is the planet's ability to develop, if you like. what I would say is that rights are at the very bottom of everything. They're the basic minimum that human beings ought to be entitled to. And the planet's ability to sustain development is kind of the upper limit of what we can achieve. Achieving sustainable development means ensuring that all people have the resources needed, such as food, water, healthcare, to fulfill their rights. And it means ensuring that humanity's use of natural resources does not stress critical Earth processes. Thank you. No, sorry. I was thanking the 5 minutes. I'm not quite done. My apologies. I'd say I'm a Canadian. I have to say thank you and I'm sorry and multiple times in any. Yeah. Another way of looking at development is that development can't be limitless. There are limits on how much the Earth can handle. In striving for more equality, which is a really important concept, we need to recognize that not everyone can have a new Lexus. This is obvious. Even a single-family dwelling in some places, or the latest Apple or Microsoft product, which is, I just saw the new Microsoft product in the mall as I was walking over here. It's pretty fancy. So at KAIROS, for example, what does this mean? We work for a Robin Hood tax, which we heard about yesterday. We work for fair systems of trade. We work for legislation that holds Canadian mining companies to account for for their abuses overseas against poor people. We work for sustainable communities. We work for what is called a rights-based framework in the language of academics, if you like. This model, it seems to me, is the same model that Bolivians prescribe in their model of Buen Vivir, and it is a model that, as we know, kind of breaks up the notion of development based entirely on gross domestic product. An example of our work was our efforts. An example of how you do human rights work in a place like Canada for development was our work around something called Bill C-300. This was a modest bill that attempted to tie government favors and services to mining companies, to the mining companies' behavior abroad. Canadian embassies do a lot of work on behalf of Canadian investors overseas. This is perhaps normal. In instances where we can confidently demonstrate illegal behavior, including behavior that leads to forced displacement, hiring of mercenaries, and corruption or tax evasion, the Canadian government ought to withhold services and loan guarantees normally offered under something called the Export Development Canada. We came very close to winning this one, but ultimately failed, but the process was very instructive to us. A recommendation that one recommendation would be that this process cannot be led by governments, north or south. Their interests are too entrenched. What has occurred in Canada over recent years is exemplary in this regard. Canadian aid is now inseparable from Canadian foreign policy. Neither can it be led by large philanthropists who also have interests of their own, other than poverty reduction, or corporations, obviously. Instead, like all human rights issues of justice, the process of development needs to be led by the victims of injustice. In the case of global economic forces, including uncaring governments, stock markets, and TNCs, so for example, led by the indigenous people of Guatemala, women in the eastern part of the DRC, and victims of war, including Palestinians. I would say, as an aside, KAIROS is one of the few agencies that still works with Palestinians because of the climate here in Canada. There are others, and there are other excellent agencies. But yet, West Bank and Gaza remain as priorities, in some ways, ironically, if not hypocritically, priorities for CEDA, which I find really interesting. Communities and groups need to be able let me just skip right to the end, because this part is sort of dry and boring, as if the other part wasn't. At KAIROS, we work towards a system where communities aren't simply consulted about development, but they have the decision-making capacity, which includes the ability to say no. I tell my students at the start of every term that a good development worker's ultimate outcome in the language of results-based management is to put themselves out of work. They chuckle appropriately, but early in one's career, it's hard to think about its end. I should say as well that people and communities should have the right to say no, even to education. We're in the middle of a process here in Canada, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, with our Indigenous brothers and sisters about education that was foisted upon them, in some ways by the churches. At KAIROS, we've tried to practice deep listening with our partners. What we've heard from our partners is the need to strengthen legal institutions, political leadership, industrial policies, advocate for a lot of great things that we heard about yesterday. But the recommendation I would like to make is that they should also have the option and the ability to say no. Thank you. That one is for real.
All right. Good afternoon. I'm really glad to be here and speaking to you more as a labor and community activist beyond my position here in the academy. And by the way, just for your information, the CAW Gindin chair in social justice and democracy is the only labor endowed chair in universities across Canada. I congratulate and thank MeToo's leadership for launching the Associations of Academies, ASAP. And I take heart the word stand. When you stand against poverty, or when collectively we stand against poverty, stand represents an action, a sense of solidarity, and an act, hopefully sometimes an act of resistance. And that the stand also means you are standing and to be ready to be counted. So it's in that vein I'm offering my comments in this critical discussions on finding, searching new strategies, new practices to tackle the global poverty elevations. I'm speaking from a labor and workers' perspective as a longtime union organizers, first in the garment industry and then in the hotel service sectors. Because what I've seen is when workers lose their jobs, or when they get injured at work and become disabled, or when they get killed on the job, they and their families are reduced to join the rank of the impoverished. And so it's in that context I want to offer my suggestions as well. And I'm going to start off with an example. And for those who are visitors from outside Canada, welcome to Canada, where in 1989, our Canadian House of Commons actually adopted unanimously to eliminate child poverty by the year 2000. Now, 12 years into the new millennium, we have seen a surge in the growing gap of child poverty. 1 in every 6 children in Canada live below poverty line. 50% of them are Aboriginal families, and 40% are from the racialized community. Children are poor because their parents cannot find decent work and are stuck in precarious employment. And to me, those are some of the links. And welcome, by the way, welcome to Toronto, where we have an unemployment rate of 17% among youth. That's 5% higher than the national unemployment rate. And I'm just going to take you out all the way back in the history and the global, and to make that some of that connections. In March 1911, I'm sure you have heard of the Triangle Factory fire in New York City that killed 146 immigrant women workers. In 1993, 81 Chinese women workers got killed in a factory fire in Shenzhen. Again, they make toys. The same year, in Thailand, 188 women workers got killed in a toy factory, the Kato factory fire. September 2012, just last month, 289 garment workers were killed in a factory fire in Karachi, Pakistan. What are some of the similarities here? These are all women workers have been affected because when the fire broke out, the factories were locked. And speaking to one of the survivors from the Kato factory fires from Thailand, the reason why she survived was when she jumped through the building to escape, she landed on the bodies of the others who died. And part of the reason I'm raising all these is I think it's important when we talk about global injustice and poverty that we link it with the larger context of the neoliberal agenda, the public austerity agenda, where there's a conscious maneuvering for multinational corporations with the ease and the speed to move their capital, the flight of capitals, and invest in anywhere that can give them a cheaper and better bargain basement labor. And at that expenses, human rights are abused, environmental degradations are ignored. And so this is a race to the bottom in here and elsewhere. It's a race to the bottom to criminalize the marginalized groups, to create the fear and to silence those who are barely making a living. So I believe it's unfair to raise the question, who benefits from such widening gap of income inequality and the obscene accumulations of wealth by the 1%. And I believe in that sense, the political and the economic elites from both the global north and the global south countries are being glorified as the best model of the survival of the fittest. And so it's in that sense that, we bring it back into the local level. When we talk about, it's a fine line, it's a very precarious and blurry line for workers between having work or not having work. And for a lot of workers, for a lot of us, we are all only one paycheck away from being laid off or unemployed. And it's the same when we talk about fighting for minimum wage increase or fighting for a living wage. It's a difference, it's a fine line between just barely surviving to engaging and participating. And recently I'm doing a research along with Grace Edward Galabusi, Apana, and Sadaf, my colleagues from our Department of Politics, on the impact of the last recessions on older racialized workers. And we use a group of workers who have victims of plant closures. And after 4 years after the plant had closed and moved elsewhere, I have one woman worker saying, in asking, what's your dreams and hopes for the future? And this is a woman worker after losing that stable work, has been on doing midnight work shift and only be able to do, and balancing work and family, only be able to take sleeps on a 2-hour interval. And her response is, I would like to be able to take my kids for vacations after 4 years. And to me, I think those are the examples between survival and participations. Okay. So bringing back to what we are doing in my work as the co-chair of the Good Jobs for All coalitions, I think at the local level, we are trying to very hard to mobilize and try to stop the further erosions of public services and public work, and trying to create that sense that, people who make a decent wage at $20 is not on any gravy train. It just, it's maintaining that sense of a community well-being. So one of the, just one example is we have been able to fight back some of the cuts And one of the other, aside from mobilizing, aside from doing demonstrations, we also enlisted 100 academics and to sign an open letter to our local Toronto mayor and the city council to stop 1,000 cleanings jobs from being privatized, for these workers to have, instead of $10.59 per hour to maintain that $20 an hour. So that was efforts that had, the organizing had produced results. And the other one, I guess the other piece is, I think in my work as a Gindin chair, for the last 2 years, we have worked with the different campus communities in creating a week of activities in Ryerson called Ryerson Social Justice Week. The first year in 2011, we used October 17th to mark the week of the International Day for the Eliminations of Poverty. And this year, in the beginning of October, we used the week of October 1st to mark October 7th, the International Day for Decent Work. And in a sense, it's saying decent work and decent futures for all, and underscoring for all, not just for some, but all those who are from the different marginalized groups. I'll use my last 5 minutes. These are just some examples, and I'm sure ours is not unique. But how do we make sure? I think it's all of us, incumbent upon all of us, as academics, as students, as activists, and members of the civil societies, is how do we make sure in our work in tackling global poverty, to eliminate global poverty, that we are not merely tinkering, but questioning, challenging some of the systemic issues, some of the root cause, as John earlier talked about, of structural inequality. How do we use our work to expose some of the invisibility of the 1%? How do we use our work to do much more sophisticated, quote unquote, it doesn't have to be corporate research. How do we do the research to follow the money? And where that money and in following the money, also picking up the trail of abuses they have left along, right? And it's in that global collective work of sharing research, sharing new thoughts and new ideas I'm also putting it across, it's when there's so much discussion, so much research on corporate social responsibility, CSR. How can we move beyond this mode of voluntary participations, as if this is only coming out from the good hearts of the corporate elites, and make it as a part of the mandatory requirement? When you invest in somewhere, you leave, it's only fair and it's only a corporate responsibility to make sure that community and the well-being of everyone in that community get lifted. And in terms of the accountability, and then I guess part of that research, part of that discussion is how do we maintain the integrity of our research and do it in a way that we are not in silos. Do it in a way that we have the audacity to challenge and ask some of the questions that might not be comfortable and that might risk us in losing the grants, the funding. How do we do that in a way that we can strengthen some of these accountability and transparency of state when we know corruption and corruptive practices are so rampant in some of the countries in the global south, and here in the global north as well? It's how do we do this in a way that makes sense, and that, maybe 10 years from now when we're coming together for another conversations, that we're not looking back, that the future, that the hope is not back in the future, but moving forward. How do we use our own spheres of influence, our positions and relative privilege in the academy, in the society, and just push and challenge each other, and making sure that the students that are in our classes would look beyond just their career and be part of that group of critical thinkers, being and engaging activists to take on some of these structural inequality issues. And I guess I think at some point, maybe some of the overhauling of these global institutions and their logics needs to be overhauled. I'm putting it as maybe, because I don't know enough. And to me, I think right now we are at the cusp of something changing, something different. The Occupy movement with its iconic slogans of we are the 99% versus 1%, has created a bit of that fertile ground for us to keep pushing. And I think it's that sense that people, a whole lot more youth are paying attention and being politicized. And so it's in that sense, how do we take on that responsibility to continue in that engagement? And I'll leave you with a couple of quotes. One quote from Robin D. Kelley in his book called Forgotten Dreams. Social movement generates new knowledge, new theories, new questions. The most radical ideas often grow out of concrete intellectual engagement with the problems of the aggrieved populations confronting systems of oppression. So how do we unpack that system of oppressions? And to me, I think it's that both at a personal level, how do we unpack and reflect on our own positions, our privilege and power? And collectively, how do we re-engage, reimagine, reclaim the space so we can do the decentering of the core that is ruined? Thank you very much.
I want to take this opportunity to thank Me Too as well and the ASAP team for coordinating this really thought-provoking conference. It's been just a pleasure to hear from so many knowledgeable speakers and expand on this Beyond 2015 dialogue. And thank you for inviting me to be part of the conversation as well. I had an interesting conversation with Professor Tiwari, who's here, a couple days ago about engaging youth in the MDGs. And she recounted this story for me of an author, Esther Duflo. And she was telling a story in her book, this Esther Duflo, about recalling her earliest memory of encountering injustice, global injustice. And she recalled reading a story when she was 6, a book about Mother Teresa, and looking at some photos of the slums in Calcutta and how that had really affected and altered the trajectory of her life. And I wanted to invite you just for a couple seconds to think back about an early experience of injustice that you encountered that has perhaps set you on this path of development work, global health work, global justice work. Just to think back for a second. With that in mind, I'd like to speak to you about the involvement of youth in the Beyond 2015 conversation. I'll cover 3 areas this afternoon, just briefly. A snapshot of the overwhelming social justice efforts and initiatives that are going on in our public school system, and in Canada, our Catholic school system is also our public school system, at both the elementary and the secondary level. Number 2, how Millennium Kids is mobilizing youth around the MDGs. And number 3, the wisdom of better engaging our youth in the next set of development goals. First of all, the snapshot of social justice. In Ontario, our children are first learning about the United Nations in the grade 5 social science curriculum. And they're often encouraged in both grade 5 and grade 6 as part of their letter writing units to write letters to members of parliament, municipal representatives, members of parliament both at the federal and the provincial level. And some students take that opportunity to ask their politicians, what kind of a response are we extending toward disasters and famines and earthquakes that they're seeing in the news. Canada's largest school board, the Toronto District School Board, has adopted a social justice action plan for its over 250,000 students. And that plan mandates that each student be involved in a local and a global social justice initiative every year of their education. Those students in the Toronto District School Board mobilized and raised over $600,000 in response to the earthquake in Haiti. And when that money was matched by the federal government, that was over $1.2 million that came out of the Toronto District School Board. That school board has also been engaged in rolling out some curriculum with Stephen Lewis on AIDS education, and that curriculum spans the primary through senior grades. They're also engaged in rolling out and test piloting some curriculum that's been developed by David Suzuki. And for 12 years, the Toronto Public Board has had a particular focused middle school where the grade 7 and 8 curriculum is taught through the lens of social justice. So this is a social justice themed school. The Toronto Catholic Board students returned to school this year, all 90,000 plus of them, to a campaign raising money for the Sahel food crisis to coincide with our government's matching program. So that was quickly thrown together to be completed by September 30th in partnership with Development and Peace. This board provides social justice workshops for over 1,000 of their student leaders annually. And 120 students in this board will build houses, schools, or volunteer in orphanages for a 2-week period during this school year in the countries of Mexico, Kenya, India, and the Philippines. Just last week, the Toronto Catholic Board gathered a group of 120 students for a service day where each was involved in volunteering in a soup kitchen, a retirement home, street patrol, or cleaning up a park. The Peel District School Board has 150,000 students. All 240 schools in that board are engaged in one form or another of social justice initiatives. And for 7 years, this board has put on an all-day workshop for grade 4 and 5 students, 600 students per year. And that workshop was on the Millennium Development Goals and international development and funded through CEDA. They're a leading board participating in the Terry Fox Run and raising money for cancer research. The York Catholic Board began its Luke 418 social justice clubs in 1994. And at this point, more than 50 of their 88 schools have one of these social justice clubs in their school. Some with as many as 100 grade 7 and 8s participating in the Social Justice Club. They host a biannual justice symposium with over 200 student leaders. And the purpose of the symposium is to empower students to become informed, reflective, and impassioned student leaders in building just societies in their schools and their communities. The York District School Board, most of their 202 schools are involved in some form of social justice initiatives, and 147 of their schools have been certified as eco-schools. They also are involved extensively with the Stephen Lewis Foundation. Finally, the Niagara Catholic School Board hosts a Justice Symposium as well for its 60 schools. They invite 3 student leaders from each of the schools participating to take part in the symposium and return to their schools to present on social justice to the student body and to initiate an action piece for their own individual schools. In the last couple of years, this board, a few of the schools in this board have launched a social justice fair, similar to the traditional science fair that we know about. And students now display their work in the gym and are graded on their research and visual written presentation about an NGO, agency, or organization that's contributing to local or global social justice. I hope this provides a bit of a snapshot of what's going on in schools. Second, how is Millennium Kids mobilizing youth around the MDGs? When I first learned about the MDGs in 2009, I was quite frustrated at the time that it had taken 9 years for me to have heard about the Millennium Development Goals. But I recall also feeling at the time a great deal of hope that if we could just get the word out that Canada had made this tremendous commitment, along with 192 other countries, to the Millennium Development Goals, that we could do this as a globe. So Millennium Kids was born out of that. Observing a growing social justice mindedness among today's youth, we identified those youth born in the year that the Millennium Declaration was signed, and they became the driving youth of Millennium Kids. Their lives are a living measuring stick for our global progress on the MDGs. MK is creating opportunities for youth to propel us forward on the MDGs as 2015 quickly approaches. We find ourselves at the intersection of youth social justice passion and a growing civic engagement amongst youth. It's at this place where these two youth phenomena converge that we find a great deal of hope. So far, we've broadcast 2 public service announcements on major national networks, in which a group of young people born in the year 2000 raise awareness about the MDGs and ask our country and our government, will we fulfill our MDG promise by the time we turn 15? I'd like to show you our most recent one of those PSAs here. And we continue to track them and film a new PSA each year as the children are growing and you see the time dwindling on the MDGs as they are getting larger.
This is the way stuff is divided in our world. 20% of the world gets about 80% of the resources. We were born in the year 2000. 2000. The year 193 countries. Committed to changing this picture by 2015. Will we fulfill the Millennium Development Goals by the time I turn 15?
We've also commissioned and recorded a Millennium Kids anthem that has turned into a download and be counted campaign. The song's called Hold On to This World, and it's a 21st century referendum on the iTunes platform, exactly where the youth are at. Every time someone downloads the song, they cast a vote in favor of fulfilling the Millennium Development Goals by 2015. We're working toward a stadium event of youth born in the year 2000 for the spring of 2013, to have the youth ask our prime ministers and every Canadian whether we'll fulfill our promise by the time they turn 15. Students will celebrate the MDGs, their MDG efforts and other accomplishments, and hear stories of transformation that are occurring in the developing countries from their heroes. All of this in an effort to inspire renewed commitment that's now required to meet the 2015 deadline. Senator Don Meredith is partnering with us on this, and I've met a couple of times with the Prime Minister's staff to keep them updated on where we're at with the youth. My final category, the wisdom of better engaging youth in the post-2015 conversation. Student social justice activities have fallen quite effortlessly into the 8 MDGs. Students are discovering that their passion for social justice aligns with government policy and with international commitments that have been made over a decade ago in the MDGs. Millennium Kids wants to help youth find their voice for justice in the public sphere. We want to suggest that youth should be welcomed post-2015, as their presence brings priorities into focus. In Canada, holding our government accountable for the MDGs has been rather difficult, since only a small percentage of Canadians have heard of the Millennium Development Goals even today. I would suggest that youth could change this by being engaged from the get-go in the post-2015 MDGs. We're tracking most closely with students who are now 15 years old. The youth will be entering university just a couple years into the new set of goals. And if those goals last another 15 years, these MKs will be 30 years old at the time of their expiry. Arguably, successful completion of the next generation of development goals will require wholehearted participation of a cohort of students that haven't even yet graduated from high school. There's a key role for youth to play in the global public launch of the next set of global development goals. I think we need to continue searching for ways to unleash youth energy and momentum now and beyond 2015. Thank you.
Thanks so much for the invitation, and thanks especially to Me Too, with whom I haven't collaborated since the late 1980s when we worked together at the McGill Daily. So the student newspaper at McGill used to be a daily. I'm outing her. I'm outing you on many fronts, Me Too. So I'm going to build on some of the comments that we heard from John and from Winnie. So moving beyond the MDGs, which you've been discussing all weekend, something that Winnie said, root causes rather than tinkering. I'm going to talk about migrant workers, workers' rights, remittances and development, and public services and community wealth. So I'm going to do that through my new book, Rethinking Unequal Exchange. And I'm going to use the book to remark on 3 themes that are listed in your program for the conference for this particular panel. So identifying problems and solutions of global poverty, linking the local with global and transnational, and then the role of civil society. So in this book, Rethinking Unequal Exchange, I'm identifying a problem, which is an emerging trend. It builds on the notion of inequality rather than simply global poverty. And as Winnie was saying, moving, or I think it was John actually, moving beyond the MDGs in our conceptualization of poverty and inequality. I look at the rise of temporary labor migration in my book. What is temporary labor migration? This is the sort of migration through which the Mayan worker, which John mentioned, comes to Canada periodically. So temporary labor migration is the employment of internationally trained workers on the basis of work permits rather than permanent migration, which for most of us in the New World was the means by which we migrated, right? We came on a permanent basis. We came to stay. We came with the right to bring our families, and we came receiving the entitlements and rights which are listed in the various levels of law of our countries. What we are seeing in the rich countries and elsewhere today is a move away from permanent migration and toward temporary migration in all sectors, not only the so-called lower skilled, for example, the farm work or the domestic work, but even in the higher levels. And for the people in the audience from the US, that's basically through the H-1A visa. Okay, so there's a rise in temporary labor migration. This, of course, means a lot for workers. And we know that most of the labor supply in the world is in the global south, right? Because the global south makes up the majority of the world population. So for those workers to now come on a temporary basis rather than permanent means incredible precarity, whether it's in terms of wages, so they generally don't get the same wage level as the local workers for the same work, and also on a societal level for the economies back home, right? They're losing the labor of various skill levels. Now, there is a North and South state interest in temporary labor migration, as I point out in the book, Why? John mentioned remittances. The way to accumulate greater amounts of remittances in the labor-sending country is via temporary migration. Because when the worker comes on the work permit, generally they cannot bring the family. So they will send more and more money home. And that money is now being viewed as a means to development. So we see an equation being made in our neoliberal age between migration, remittances, and development. And one institution, which I talk about in the book, which is little known, is the Global Forum on Migration and Development. This is essentially the World Trade Organization, but for the trade in workers. Governments are meeting yearly to discuss the trade in workers. Bilateral agreements are forged. You need 30 teachers, I need 40 nurses. And the scary thing about the Global Forum on Migration and Development is that it is not seeking to make multilateral agreements. It has understood that that failed at the WTO. So it's much more flexible. Governments can make their own bilateral or maybe regional agreements, and it is all very much in accordance with the needs of employers. Of course, employers like the temporary migration because it allows them to access a much more flexible labor force. And one of the sectors in which we see that happening for the longest time, meaning from the late 80s, is in the nursing and other caring labor markets. And that's why I focus on nursing labor markets in my book. Going on to the next theme, linking the local, global, and transnational. So in my book, I look at 3 trend-setting countries. That is Canada, the US, and the Philippines. Canada and the US are the first rich country governments to shift over to the increasing dependence on temporary migrant nurses. They did this from the late 80s, and from that time, you have seen other rich countries or labor importing countries also make the same shift. So Australia followed suit, Britain followed suit, and so on. In the Canadian story, I look to find why did employers shift from permanent to temporary migration in terms of the means to employ internationally educated nurses. So in the Canadian story, you have an account, and I do historical sociology, so it's a 50-year story. What we see in the Canadian instance is from the rise of public health care in Canada, we have actually squeezed more and more labor out of our nurses, which is the primary professional caring labor force in hospitals, which is the main site of healthcare delivery in our current notion of healthcare. And what I show is that we have created politically a shortage of nurses in Canada. In the 90s, we started to lose nursing labor. They migrated on the temporary basis to the US, nurses from Canada, and they also just pulled their labor out of the market, stopped working as nurses. So there we see one account of why employers shifted over to the demand for temporary migrant nurses. In the US story, we have, of course, a private healthcare system. But the same shift happened come the early 90s. And what I show there is very much the political economy of healthcare expenditures in the US. And while nursing labor was not a major cost in the system, it is nursing labor that was tackled as the place for cost cutting from the 1990s. And this increased use of temporary migrant nurses was a part of that. What were the real cost pushers in the healthcare system in the US and continuing today? Well, we know one of them, you've been discussing it here, the pharmaceutical industry. So pharmaceutical costs. There's another whole monopoly industry which we discuss very rarely, and I do a full analysis of that in my US chapter. That's the medical technology industry. And that industry has pushed costs, especially in the hospital sector, both in the US and in Canada. And the other third big force in healthcare expenditures is physicians' costs. Okay, so the predominantly male healthcare labor force, which has historically had more political clout in most societies, as in the US, that has been an increasing cost steadily, which within the existing political structure was not challenged. The third big story in my book is the Philippines. And the Philippines I look at as a southern state which has shaped this shift to temporary labor migration. Why the Philippines? Because from the 70s, the Philippines focused its state efforts on the export of labor. And one of the biggest sectors of labor export is nursing labor export. The Philippines is used now as a model for other southern states. Again, in terms of this link between migration, remittances, and development. So I look at why the Philippines shifted over to labor export in the 1970s. There's a whole story of economic development there, post-independence. The role of civil society, the last theme. So from this analysis, there are many things that can be done around temporary labor migration and this link between migration and remittances and development. There is a union role. So as was mentioned, I work for a nurses' union, And this book actually came out of my work for the central labor body in Canada, the Canadian Labour Congress, where I started to look at temporary labor migration. So what I'm doing now with this analysis is I'm taking it to the nurses' unions in particular so that they can begin to formulate a response. Why the nurses' unions? Because the key middleman in the story right now are the labor recruitment agencies. And what I believe needs to happen is that unions need to replace those recruiters. They have to be the ones that allow employers access to nurses. And this has to be, of course, cross-border, because the employment of nurses is happening more and more cross-border, particularly through the temporary status. There's a role for policy advocates. What I show in the Philippines story is that post-independence, and the Philippines became independent in 1942, fairly early in the African and Asian timelines. So the Philippines had a domestic development strategy from the 40s. Come 1960, that project was abandoned. And in abandoning it, the return to foreign exchange difficulties, all the things that had developed during the periods of Spanish and US colonialism returned. And part of the solution then that the state identified was in exporting workers, because it is only through workers' remittances that they can access foreign exchange, meaning the state, which is then open for the state to use for its own purposes. And what are remittances used for in the Philippines? The money goes to the families, and that's the so-called development that we are envisioning in our neoliberal definition. But the state takes the foreign exchange. So the state takes the American dollars and uses it to deal with its balance of payments difficulties. Where do those balance of payments difficulties come from? It's the same source of the external debt. So it's not simply to pay off the external debt. That money is used to cover the expenditures of foreign exchange by the ruling classes of society. That is the landowners, which is the historic elite, which was suppressed in the time of the National Development Strategy. And it is the foreign investors, the primarily US investors that remained in the Philippines post-independence, who also didn't like the domestic development strategy. So those forces are spending more money abroad, and therefore the state needs as much foreign exchange as possible, and in addition to that, steady loans from the private banks. So what I offer in my book, One More Minute, thank you, is an alternative understanding of remittances, which pushes us to coming back to the state with a new, or maybe a renewed idea of development, which is people-oriented. Policy advocates like you, academics, are key in making that argument to states. I think another way to get to this type of analysis as academics is to work closer with labor bodies. And I'm going in November to Public Service International's Congress in Durban. Public Service International is the International Federation of Public Sector Unions. And they work on the international policy level, and they did actually take up the MDGs as a place to advocate. And I would very much encourage academics to reach out to those kinds of labor federations who themselves have policy direction upon which you can build and in which you can collaborate. One key area for Public Service International is to strengthen the notion of public services, which, as we know, is under attack in rich and poor countries alike. And I'll just refer you to a paper I've done recently for the Ontario Nurses Association called Easy to Take for Granted, the Role of Care Work and Public Services in Wealth Creation. You can find that at ona.org/research, or come and talk to me afterward. I think if we want to talk about global poverty alleviation, we need to talk again about the role of public services in equalizing living standards, and it is a crucial role for the state to play. We can't let it go, and we know that the dominant notions of development today are all about privatizing public services. Thanks very much.
I would like to draw your attention to a new book called Struggling for Effectiveness, CEDA and Canadian Foreign Aid. Came out last month, McGill Queen's Press, edited by Stephen Brown. There aren't very many books on Canadian foreign aid. This is quite a good one, quite a good collection. And I have a chapter in it, and it's on, guess what, advocacy, and that's what I'm going to talk about. Yesterday, several speakers lamented the fact that the Canadian public doesn't know very much about the Millennium Development Goals or what's coming next or development assistance or anything else we've been talking about. And of course, we're not alone in Canada. It's the same in many of the developed countries. Why is that? I mean, if you looked at the US presidential debates and the vice presidential debates, not one of the things that we've talked about in the last 3 days came up. And I bet you if they had, if one of them had brought it up, they probably would have got slammed for it by somebody not long afterwards. If governments are going to do the kinds of things that we want them to do, they have to be persuaded. We talk a lot about political will or the lack of political will. Robert Chambers once described lack of political will being a government acting in its own best interests. Whenever it's accused of having a lack of political will, it must be doing something right in terms of its own narrow self-interest. Another way of looking at the lack of political will is to think of it as the absence of permission from the public to do the kinds of things that governments might like to do. You could talk to quite a few politicians, and I bet you if we had invited members of parliament here to be part of this, they would have endorsed a lot of what we're saying. But they won't put it in a speech. They won't talk about it on TV because they haven't got permission from the public. Just as Barack Obama and Mitt Romney, if they were inclined to speak on these issues, don't really have permission. They will get into trouble if they put it into an election platform. Who tells the public, who tells the Canadian public about development or poverty or underdevelopment or any of the things that we've been talking about? Well, the media does, and sometimes they do a fairly good job, but the media is patchy, and we've got an awful lot to choose from. There aren't just 3 or 4 TV channels anymore, and people are bombarded with information, and they really don't know what to select and what to disregard. Beyond the media, who's out there? Who's available to tell Canadians about these issues? NGOs, development organizations, people on the front lines of some of these issues. And we've heard a good cross-section of things that people are doing in this panel discussion. But in fact, I think if you look at what international development NGOs are telling the Canadian public, you get quite a different picture. About 20 years ago, Robert Putnam, an American academic, wrote a book called Making Democracy Work, Civic Traditions in Modern Italy. He was looking at the question of why southern Italy is so underdeveloped and why the north is so much more developed. He looked at a whole range of issues. Is it climate? No, the climate really isn't that much different. Is it natural resources? No, in fact, the south in some ways is better endowed than the north. When he went through all the different possibilities, what he came up with, and he went back over 500 years of civic traditions in Italy, what he came up with was that civil society in the north and civic traditions in the north were much stronger. The civil society had developed in the north, and in the south it had been stunted. And so in the north, you had better governance because civil society was acting to watchdog the state, it was acting as a supplement to the state, it was acting as a complement to the state, it was holding the state accountable for its actions, and so you got a better kind of democracy, a better kind of governance. Well, that book, and it's a good book, it's well worth reading because it tells us a lot about our world and it tells us a lot about the developing world as well. That book was read quite a lot. And so in the 90s, we had a great surge of interest in civil society, particularly civil society in the South. The pendulum in this business, the development business, the pendulum swings back and forth. And so we get a lot of fads and trends. And I think the fad, the interest in civil society has to some extent passed. And now we're putting much more emphasis on the state. In Canada, the climate for advocacy, the climate for the kinds of things that we expect of civil society has, I think, gone off the rails. We have a government, a federal government, that is not interested in hearing what civil society has to say, if it's at all critical or antagonistic or antithetical to what the government's own policies are. And so in the international development business, what we've seen, the first and probably most blatant example of it was the cutting of funds to KAIROS, not just because of what KAIROS was doing and saying, but also because of some things they weren't doing and saying. I mean, they couldn't even do their calculations right. But KAIROS was cut off at the knees, 100% cutting. It wasn't just that they cut off the public advocacy work that KAIROS was doing. They cut off everything. The next one up on the chopping block was the Canadian Council for International Cooperation, CCIC, which is the umbrella organization for all Canadian NGOs. 100% cut. But they didn't just cut it at the end of the financial year. They let it drag out into the summer so that all of their reserves were used up. They were running on fumes, and then they told them no more money. No more money for anything. So they went from a staff of 30 down to about 3 or 4. Other organizations have been very seriously chopped or completely axed, matched. The only organization working on women's issues completely cut off. Mennonite Central Committee on Development and Peace, very serious cuts to their work, no doubt because they were fairly outspoken on some issues that the government didn't want to hear about. So this has served as a wonderful lesson for everybody in the international development business. International development NGOs never actually did very much advocacy work. Just to give you an example well, just some numbers. World Vision, which is the biggest by far Canadian NGO in Canada, World Vision spends 10 times more on fundraising in a year than CEDA, the Canadian government, spends on public awareness. The message that Canadians are getting from development NGOs is a fundraising message. And the fundraising message invariably is about children and it's about emergencies. It's about symptoms. It's not about causes. It's not about the serious things that we've been talking about over the last 3 or 4 days. I got a taste of this 2.5 years ago. I was on the board of a fairly large, not a fairly large, a very large Canadian international development NGO, and I wrote an op-ed that was printed in the Globe and Mail, and in this op-ed I said that CEDA Minister Bavoda should be fired. The only thing that actually happened was that I was fired. By lunchtime, I was gone. The NGO was so terrified that something that I said in my personal capacity, there was no mention of the NGO in the article whatsoever. They were so terrified that this would rebound on them financially that I had to be purged as quickly as possible. So why do we have advocacy? I mean, obviously, we've talked about all the reasons for advocacy in the last few days, but advocacy is not a new thing. I mean, NGOs have always been doing advocacy work. When you think about the Anti-Slavery Society, I mean, it worked to liberate slaves. It ran the Underground Railway and it did a number of other things. It provided services, but it wanted to end slavery. That was what it was about, advocacy. If you think about organizations that work with, let's say, mentally handicapped children, they're a service delivery organization. They provide services, but they also look out for the rights of those children. So they have an advocacy function, and we don't question that. We don't argue with them. If they're critical of the government of Saskatchewan for not providing services or not doing the right thing in terms of the rights of the mentally handicapped children of Saskatchewan. We don't cut off all their funding and consign them to the garbage heap. We pay attention. There's a reason that we listen to NGOs. There's a reason even for funding NGOs to do this. It helps to shape and to leaven the policy that governments have in these areas. Now, there's a difference. There's been a big debate grown up over the last couple of years as government has chopped organizations that have been doing advocacy. The most controversial areas have been in the environment, where NGOs that were against the pipeline, what's it called? What's the name? Northern Gateway Pipeline. NGOs that were against that were accused of being, I think they even said terrorist organizations, but certainly some of them were receiving funding from foreign places like the United States, and that this was totally inappropriate, and these organizations should be stopped in their tracks. That it's not appropriate for NGOs to do advocacy. In fact, it's not even legal. They're sending out the Canadian Revenue Agency to check up on organizations that are doing the wrong thing. So let's just have a look at the policy. I mean, what are NGOs allowed to do and not allowed to do? There's two distinctions, or there's a distinction to be made. Non-profit organizations and charitable organizations are not the same thing. If you're a charitable organization, you must be non-profit. But if you're non-profit, you don't have to be a charitable organization. Non-profits can do whatever they want. They can say whatever they want. If they receive funding from government or not, they are not constrained by any rule or regulation or law in terms of what they can say. It's different for charities. Charities are allowed to give tax receipts. And what that means is if you give a $100 tax receipt to somebody, the government is not taking in that $100 as taxes. So the government, in a sense, is subsidizing these organizations. So, the government wants to know that a charitable organization is engaged in charitable activities. So what's the definition of charitable activities, and what can a charitable activity say or not say? A lot of people hide, including NGOs, they'll hide behind the argument that you're only allowed to spend 10% on advocacy. That's not true. You're only allowed to spend 10% on political activity. And let me just give you a definition. The Canadian Revenue Agency says that political activity, first of all, you have to be involved in whatever it is. It has to be nonpartisan. But you can spend up to 10%, and for smaller organizations as much as 20% on political activity, if these fall generally under the concept of urging, either directly or through the public, elected representatives or public officials, Canadian or otherwise, to adopt or change laws or policies or decisions. So that's legal. That's legal, it's understood. But public awareness is something quite different. Public awareness and campaigns are not restricted by the 10% rule or the 20% if you're a smaller organization. Some organizations are created only to do public awareness. They're created only to push on certain issues. Amnesty International, it's a charitable organization. All it does is advocacy. That's all it does. The C.D. Howe Institute, a conservative think tank, they're a charitable organization. The North-South Institute, the Conference of Defense Associations Institute, which is created to promote public debate on national security and defense issues. That's a charitable organization. So if you can have a charity working on defense issues or human rights issues, why can't you have a charity that might have something to say about a pipeline and environmental issues? What's happened is that the government has put a very serious chill on the advocacy work of international development NGOs. As I said, most of them were not doing very much advocacy anyway, and now they've been terrified into silence. I thought I would read the last two chapters of the last two paragraphs Sorry. I know he's going to give me the 1 minute, the last two paragraphs of my chapter. But let me read you something before that. Here's a quotation from Lawrence Cannon, who was mentioned by one of the previous speakers. When he was our foreign minister, Lawrence Cannon went to a meeting, a high-level ministerial meeting of the Community of Democracies that was held in Poland in 2010. And here's something that he said. You'd be surprised that this was our foreign minister representing the Harper government. It's no secret to those of us in the room that a vibrant, established, and pluralistic civil society is an essential ingredient of democracy. Civil society helps citizens find a voice to be more effective participants in political life. But beyond its role as a check and monitor, civil society is an important bridge to help governments connect to the people they serve and build positive relationships. Civil society is also a means through which citizens can contribute to thriving social, cultural, and economic sectors that are characteristic of healthy democracies. I had a very hard time getting that speech. Normally, ministers actually post speeches on their websites, and I had to call his office and explain what I wanted it for. I was writing a chapter for a book, but essentially they were giving me a hard time to get the chapter. So the way I ended this, and I'll read it to you. I apologize for reading it, but if I wing it, it'll take longer. And besides, it's extremely well written. There's no obligation on the part of government to fund the advocacy work of civil society organizations. But in doing so, a government can promote two things. The first is a wider constituency of citizen voices, including some who may find the public square crowded by those with outsized resources. Second, it can promote a quality of voice that might not find its way into the public square if it had to rely solely on private resources. Civil society can, in fact, skipped a sentence. Civil society can, in fact, do everything that Cannon described, but not if civil society organizations operate in fear that something they say might antagonize the government and bring them to the edge of financial ruin. Nor is there an obligation for a charitable organization to engage in public education and advocacy work, with or without government funding. However, the development problems of the poorest countries cannot be solved by aid alone, much less by NGO projects. Moreover, by dealing exclusively in development and feel-good opportunities for Canadians who want to adopt a child or dig a well, some of Canada's most prominent NGOs miss the bigger picture and present a misleading image to Canadians. It's not only or even mostly about showcasing best practices in international development. It's about fixing what's broken all around the showcase. It's not about building a more efficient underground railway. It's about ending slavery. The trade-off for civil society organizations, international development NGOs, the trade-off for them and for governments that weigh the value of supporting them has pitted voice against service provision instead of making them complementary. It has also created a situation in which many of Canada's largest international organizations have succumbed to the politics of income maximization, holding their collective tongue on issues that are fundamental to the mandate they've set for themselves. Thank you.
So now, do we have until 4 for discussion? Okay, so we have until 4 o'clock for questions from the audience. So I invite the audience to ask questions. I know the organisers of this event have also asked me to express to the members of the panel that they would be interested in hearing from the panel about any suggestions or questions that the panelists have for ASAP as to what areas ASAP should be addressing and what areas they would like ASAP to pay attention to. So while the panelists are thinking about that, I will ask if there are any questions from the audience, please. And if you could introduce yourselves as you ask a question. I see, Mina, we have someone over here.
Yeah, my name is Josh Okello from Tyndale University. I have a question that goes to Winnie. Yes. You talked about blowing whistle when it comes to industrial work and people dying. I'm just wondering if there's a way it can be done in time so that we don't have to act after people have died or after we've lost something very important, maybe in the economy. That's a question.
Yeah, thank you for the questions. I'll just kick it off, and maybe other panelists might have comments. I guess my standpoint is, the examples that I was listing, if you take a look at historically and geographically, the only things that's different is a change of locations. What's consistent has been the pattern of exploitations among the workers. And for a lot of the multinational corporations, and also for the governments, they actually see it, and to me I see this as both as the exploitation of workers and taking advantage and the linkage with racism and sexism, right? And it's in those intersectionality that we need to search for new answers, and that I think where ASAP can play a key role. Within the labor movement, there's a lot of work more focusing on health and safety, in making sure that the workplace health and safety issues as a preventive piece are being respected and being educated in terms of public awareness. However, and I think for workers both here and in particularly in global south countries, it's when you are desperate for survival, you gloss over these issues and think that I can take that risk. I need to put food on the table. And that's where sometimes that food it's at the expense of your life.
Once more, my name is Hannah Atom. I happen to be the project coordinator for the Poverty and Precarious Employment Project, led by Grace Ewert and for the region of Peel. So after working on this project, I have the impression that precarious employment is the root cause of poverty worldwide. And to the best of my knowledge, I know precarious employment hurts everyone, including businesses. So, which means there is a real cost to precarious employment on businesses. So my question is, how do you get the businesses involved? How do we make them know that if you employ somebody precariously, say you employ one person, you pay the person $20 and the next person gets $10, it's obvious we are human. The person working and getting $10 will obviously not work as hard as the person getting $20. So in terms of performance, quality, it's going to hurt those businesses. So how do you get them know that it's actually hurting them?
Which of the panelists would like to address that? Winnie or Salimah? Salimah.
I'll respond by talking about a Marxian concept, which I talk about in my book, which is the reserve army of labor. So this idea is that if you actually have a pool of workers that are unemployed or underemployed, well then employers will always have the ability to draw out more work from the workers that they are employing, or by getting rid of those employees and bringing in workers from the pool that is unemployed and underemployed. Now, this is a structural part part of the way that we organize our economies in the world today, both on a national scale and an international scale. So the temporary migrant workers that I'm talking about are a part of that pool of unemployed or underemployed. And they are drawn upon from predominantly the poorer countries by richer country employers. So while they come to Canada and earn less than workers doing the exact same work, they actually perform the same amount of work. Why? Because they are precarious. Because the wage that they would get back home, or maybe the working conditions, are lower or worse. So when you're talking about precarious employment in Peel, it's not that different. If you have a worker who has an option of extremely low social security payments, right? That our welfare system is very bare bones, it's below the poverty line, well then they will be pleased to take that job, which is maybe $1 over the minimum wage. And they will work to keep that job. And that's what we're seeing in our economy today. Even amongst unionized workers, what we are seeing is that they are willing to work harder, receive less, because they don't want to fall into that pool of unemployed workers. That's the inequality that we need to fight against in order to reverse this rise of precarious employment. And that is not a struggle which all employers are clearly going to join us in. It's actually a struggle which puts a different mode to employers. And the strategy is to force them to shift modes.
Yeah, just quickly to add on to this is, I believe it's important for governments to take the leadership on this, right? Employers are not going to be just doing the right thing out of their own heart. You look at the Employment Standards Act, right? Setting the minimum wage. At this point in Ontario, we have $10.25 an hour as minimum wage. That was after 9 years of being frozen. It went up. And now we're looking at the next increase. How do we campaign and fight for the next increase? These are not going to happen unless we have legislations that's going to, and I'm using employment standards as one of the pieces, because like Salimah was saying, precarious employments create a vulnerable workforce that enable employers to maximize their exploitations. And what we have right now with the federal governments, we have a government who is encouraging and abating these employers to take advantage and increasing the migrant workers coming in and allowing employers, enabling employers to pay them between 5 to 15% less than the prevailing wages. And when you're in that context, when you're working alongside as a full-time person, you're working alongside with someone who might be part-time, someone else who a temp agency worker, and then someone else who's now coming in under the temporary foreign workers program, you are much less likely to stand up and say, I need a raise.
We have a question at...
Can I just add to that? I agree with what Winnie was saying. I think it's up to governments to set proper standards before they invite companies in. I think one of the things that we've heard a lot in the last few years is that foreign direct investment is very important. Foreign direct investment is 5 times or 25 times, I forget how much, the size of foreign aid, as though foreign aid was somehow responsible for all the bad things that have happened. I mean, nobody ever said that foreign aid was the answer, and nobody ever said that foreign direct investment wasn't important. But foreign direct investment has to complement what the government wants for its people, so that it has to set standards, labor standards, minimum wage, labor rights, and all the rest of it. It also has to try and attract the kind of investment that will create jobs. An awful lot of foreign direct investment, if you look at the numbers, they're terribly skewed by the extractive industries. The big bucks are in the extractive industries, and they don't hire a lot of people. They can produce revenue. Governments are desperate for any kind of revenue, so there's a race to the bottom on some of these things. But what governments really need to try and attract is investment that's there for the long haul, and investment that is labor intensive rather than capital intensive.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Okay, we have 2 questions at the back and then 2 questions here at the front. In the interests of time, what I will do is actually group the next 4 questions. So if we could get 1, 2, 3, 4 questions and then have the panelists respond to them, if that's okay. Just because, okay, and then we'll have another set of questions after that, okay? Otherwise, I don't think we're going to get time to address everything. Thank you.
Right. My question is going to Sara, who spoke about engaging youth when we talk about MDGs, and even as we talk about going beyond 2015. I think it's very important for us to engage youth, engage children when we talk about development issues. But I think we also have to be aware that young people in different parts of the world face peculiar circumstances. And I think one such circumstance that I want to draw our attention to are children and young people that are caught up in civil wars and in conflict zones in places like Africa. I think in as much as children and young people in those parts of the world have rights to education, have rights to health care. I think they also face a different set of needs, which I would maybe classify as some of these people having not getting the right to security, not getting the right to childhood. For some of these people, especially those that are child competent, their entire childhood has been lost. So I guess what I'm saying here, I think we also have to pay attention to some of those specific needs based on the context in which some of these children are located. Mm-hmm. And I'm interested in, for instance, how we talk about transitional justice and children. Sometimes when we talk about some of these issues, we tend to neglect children. If you look at the role of war crime tribunals, if you look at the role of truth and reconciliation commissions, children are not very much considered. Mm-hmm. So I guess my point here is we have to look at those peculiar circumstances and see what specific needs those children have. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And if we could go and pick up the next question, please. And if people would please introduce themselves when answering the question too. Hi. Thank you.
This is Harihar Behra, a citizen from Toronto. I have a question to Salimah as regards the temporary migration.
Diana Aiden-Shanker of Bard College, New School, and Global Momenta. So there are some great lenses and perspectives that have been brought to the discussion on how to go beyond 2015 and end poverty, and bringing in the civil society and community leadership voice. Begs the question of another voice that I want to share and prompt a question for you. And that's that of the social investors. So I do a lot of work with investors, both philanthropists and impact investors, people looking to move money for social good, and they don't speak about these issues in the same way, but they are talking about the same thing. So they are talking about ending poverty, which turns out is bad business, and they are talking about, and a bad investment, and they are talking about improvements on these areas of concern, but framed in different language. One of the things that I hear increasingly from social investors is the effectiveness and strategic value of applying a gender lens to ending poverty, not as a problem to be solved, rather as a solution to the problem. So I would love to hear more from your perspective on how a gender lens towards ending poverty is not adding one more list item to a problem to be solved, but rather part of the solution to being more effective in advancing the global agenda.
Okay, and we could take one more question before the panel response.
There we go. My name is Sara, and I just wanted to. I was at the panel discussion yesterday, and there was a speaker from the Ted Rogers School of Management speaking about. He was like the ethics guy. Who? Chris McDonald. Yeah, Chris McDonald. He said something that really sort of was perplexing to me. He said that it's in the benefit of corporations and employers to, or just employers to pay their employees more, because it's paying any less would make for quote unquote lousy employees, and which is sort of, I also, in response to your question, I work also with Winnie on the research project for looking at the reemployment challenges of racialized workers who worked in the auto parts manufacturing industry, and talking. During the interview stage, we were talking to some of the workers. They expressed that there were temporary workers and more permanent workers working in the factories, and the temporary workers would say that they knew that the person that they were working beside was getting paid more than them, but yet that didn't influence the way that they would work. In fact, they would work harder because, like Salimah said, there's a reserve of more precarious employees who are ready to do any work for any pay just to be making some money. So I think it's incredibly problematic to say that workers who get paid less make for more lousy or less hardworking employees. Okay. Just wanted to address that.
Thank you. So now I will turn to the panelists. There are a number of questions, and people are welcome to respond to them. And Mina is coming with the microphone.
Okay, so I'm going to take up the question of what to do about this rising use of temporary migrant workers. And then I'll also answer the question of the conference organizers, which is what issues should ASAP prioritize. So I've written extensively about what to do about temporary migrant workers. A lot of it is directed to the state. So as Winnie was saying, government and also Ian was saying, government has a big role to play. So what we advocated at the Canadian Labour Congress was a variety of things which talk to the needs of the locally based workers, as you mentioned, but also the migrant workers. So, getting at some of the root causes, we need to return to a system of training workers in Canada. So, whether it's women who are underemployed, whether it's First Nations people who are unemployed, or it is industrial workers who are displaced from work, they all need training, and this training must be supported by employers and by the state. We used to have more of that type of model in Canada in the 60s and the 70s. We've lost all of that. And employers find it easier to simply take the trained labor from elsewhere. So we need to have government bring back policies of training that are locally oriented. That must be part of a larger strategy of people-oriented development. And there we need to look at what types of production are environmentally sustainable as well as socially sustainable. So creating a situation where companies survive simply by paying workers less and less and competing with each other in those terms is not going to be socially sustainable. So we need to bring back our vision of development to social and ecologically just methods. In terms of the migrant workers, because this is a global phenomenon, as I show in my book, right? We have states and large development agencies or intergovernmental bodies like the OECD that are pushing temporary labor migration. So we aren't going to get rid of it instantly. The way we need to respond to that then is that in Canada, for example, many unions have taken the position that we need immediate permanent residency for workers coming in on the temporary work permits, okay? So because we aren't going to get rid of the temporary foreign worker program, which is the institutional means by which employers are accessing the temporary migrant workers, what we are saying is that we need to demand that those workers, once they get chosen by employers and they get their work permit from Citizenship and Immigration Canada, they need to be accessing permanent residency. Through permanent residency, they should have the legal, at least in legal terms, the full rights that locally based workers are accessing. What we also need to do is we need to mobilize internationally along those lines. So we need all unions around the world to be taking the position that as soon as a migrant worker comes in, they must access the same rights as we do. And that means they must have the right to organize or join unions, right, which is not the case, even for nurses coming in on temporary work permits. We know the story of farm workers or domestic workers who themselves don't have, in all provinces, the right to organize unions, okay? So farm workers in Alberta that have Canadian citizenship do not have the right to organize. So why would the migrant farm worker have that? So we need to assure that all workers have the right to organize in all sectors, and that all internationally educated workers are accessing those same rights. So whether the internationally educated are here on permanent residency status or temporary, we need to be sure that they are equal. And sorry, now I will respond to the organizer's question. What are the priority issues? I think, as I said at the end of my presentation, that the notion of strengthening public services, I think that's a key issue for policy advocates to focus on in terms of alleviating poverty, equalizing living standards. So strengthening public services. And I would also say that valuing caring labor. So a feminist approach to poverty would push us to looking at how we remunerate caring workers, whether they are the day-to-day caregivers or the registered nurses. So in all the skill levels, these workers are undervalued around the world, in all cultures, including the rich country or so-called developed countries. And we need to bring a development focus to that, because that is contrary to human development, to undervalue the very workers that actually make for workers who become the productive so-called source of economic growth. Now, all of this would require a longer perspective in terms of development and advocacy. And I would encourage you to take that on. That's the contrary of, setting goals with numerical targets. And I think that's what we need to really tackle the shortcomings of a development model which has reached its limits historically and globally.
Let me do the postmodern thing, or maybe the pre-modern thing, and take up the question of gender. And that is, I would say, from our perspective, KAIROS is mandated by its board to work with women's organizations or explicitly feminist organizations in everywhere we work. So 25% of our partners in every part of the world has to be a women's organization, and we surpass that by, for example, in my portfolio, which is the Middle East, 3 out of 5 of our partner organizations are women's organizations, 1 in Israel, 2 in Palestine. There are other organizations in Canada that are excellent on this. I implore people to look at work of the Nobel Women's Initiative. Also works really well in promoting not women as victims, but promoting women as my colleague who leads this area of work for us as protagonists for rights and development. So they have a program that's not dissimilar to ours, which is called Women of Courage. Ours is called Women of Courage, and that is we do educational campaigns where we bring women from either Aboriginal communities in Canada or from conflict situations around the world to come here and on speaking tours, to speak with students, to speak with churches, unions, whatever, but women human rights defenders as protagonists in their own struggles. There are two pieces of legislation that legislates the Canadian government to work this way as well. One has an impact on CEDA, Overseas Development Assistance, and the other has an impact on the Department of Foreign Affairs. The one that Canada has signed on and actually has an action plan for implementation on women's rights is related to the UN Security Council Resolution 1325. Canada is one of the few countries that has an action plan for implementation to work on women's rights. It's a very good action plan, but it's almost completely ignored. So Department of Foreign Affairs has a very strong mandate, although ignored, to work on gender equality through that piece of legislation or that piece of policy. CEDA, of course, is meant to fall under a piece of legislation called the Overseas Official Development Assistant Accountability Act, which mandates CEDA to work on poverty reduction through a lens of human rights. I don't know what has happened to this act. It is completely ignored in the country. I bet a lot of practitioners of development probably don't even know. Well, maybe I'm wrong, but I know why it's ignored by the government, because it was a piece of legislation that was proposed as a private member's bill by the opposition, but it is law in the country, and it mandates CEDA to work accountably with its development assistance for human rights, which includes, of course, the promotion of gender rights. Yeah.
I just want to respond briefly to the gentleman's comment at the back of the room. I really appreciate you drawing our attention to the specific circumstances of children, and in particular children struggling in civil war. And it's something that we do try to balance as we're encouraging youth to make themselves familiar and become aware with children's circumstances around the world and the inequities that exist. And we turn our minds to balancing that with something that James Orbinski mentioned yesterday, that idea of hope, and not overwhelming students and youth with a dismal outlook that's hopeless. It's very much at the front of our minds. Thanks for your comment.
Just adding on, responding from the comments about the gender analysis from a solution point of view. I think it's important to recognize that, Ian earlier talked about the defunding that the federal government has done in particular, not only to the NGOs who are doing international development, but during the initial year, the first year, when they came in as a minority government, there were 106 agencies and organizations that got their funding delisted or reduced. And 60% of those agencies that were affected have a gender perspective in a lot of main women's organizations. And so I'm delighted to hear about the Social Investors Project. I guess I'm taking it from the point, if we take a look at Canada, with 70% of part-time workers are all women, not making enough to make ends meet, then it becomes an economic issue that if women could have employment, full-time employment, it would enhance their ability to giving it back to the community, right? And it's all part of that good, quote-unquote, economic sense. And I think the other piece to look at it from the importance of grounding these issues on employment is also recognizing that at the end of the day, women are still the primary caregivers, be it in the child care or the elderly care. And that if there's a way where, it's following on what Salimah said, if women's work is valued, then some of these caring work needs to be attached with a dollar figure. It also it's also part of that whole piece, I think. Sorry, I'm rushing to try to get this out. Part of the problem, I think, where in terms of when women workers in particular are in precarious employment, when they have to travel an hour and a half on transportations to reach their affordable housing living space, that means much less time that they can spend with their family and with their children. And to me, those are some of that core pieces that ground these children to become youngsters and eventually become part of the workforce. And so I think in that regards, it only makes sense. It only makes good economic sense, but also fundamentally the social fabric of the community to have women being able to enjoy the equal work for work of equal value, right? Then last but not the least, following on Salimah's lead in terms of ASAP, I really like the acronyms ASAP. Mm-hmm. It represents also some sense of urgency, that we can't just have lofty goals to be put on policy papers or as posters on the wall, but how can we make these as actions that could be meaningful and relevant to those who have been most affected. So, bring it back to home back in Toronto and in Canadian context, I'd like to see ASAP as part of the allies in some of the mobilizing, some of the research work that we're doing on living wage and minimum wage. The Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives is pushing on the living wage. Workers' Action Centre in Toronto and elsewhere in Ontario are launching the minimum wage campaigns. So, and this is a matter of beyond survival. How can people live with dignity both at work and in their community? So those are the pieces I like to see ASAP to be at the table. Thank you.
Thank you.
John, your point about the ODA Accountability Act, I've had discussions with lawyers about this, and they say, there's an awful lot of legislation on the books, motherhood legislation, and this is motherhood. I mean, it talks about human rights and poverty and perspectives of the poor, but, you could wrap almost anything into that if you wanted to. It's very general. When you get a general motherhood act like that or bill, lawyers tell me that it doesn't actually grow teeth until it's tested in the courts. There has to be somebody willing to test it, and there actually is a case. A lawyer in Toronto has taken CEDA to court over funding, over aid programs in Ethiopia. It's fairly complicated, but and saying that Ethiopia, breaks all the rules on human rights, and why is it such a big aid recipient from Canada? So it'll be interesting to see what happens. It would be nice to see CETA wrapped over the knuckles on that, and it will start to make them pay attention to that ODA Act a little bit more seriously if it bites. The point about social investors, of course, social investors and also ethical consumers, they don't come to this naturally. I mean, maybe they would, but they need help, they need information, and the information has to come from somewhere. And so organizations that do this are extremely important. And I think what we're seeing, a lot of this is not coming from the old-fashioned NGOs that are out there helping and doing neat projects in developing countries. A lot of it is coming from a kind of a new wave NGO. Organizations like Global Witness in Britain, in the US, Resolve, and the Enough Project. In this country, Partnership Africa Canada has done work in this area. We see, with the Diamond Development Initiative, we are constantly being called by jewelers who want to know where can they get ethical diamonds, where can they get clean diamonds. And we're trying to help them with some answers on that one. So I think there is something new coming along. Or NGOs that are working on these issues have a policy perspective and are not dependent on aid donors who don't like to hear these messages. The more dependent you are on a CETA that doesn't want to hear about it, the less likely you are to be able to do that kind of work. Ideas for ASAP. About 4 or 5 weeks ago, CCIC, Canadian Council for International Cooperation, had a meeting in Ottawa with CACID. It was a joint meeting with the Canadian Association for Studies in International Development, academics, to talk about the Millennium Development Goals and what next. There were 8 people there from CETA. One of the people, including CETA's, the head of the CETA Policy Department, one of the CETA people told me, he said, if this had been a CCIC meeting, and CCIC did most of the work, and CCIC provided most of the content, ironically, he said, if this had been a CCIC event, we might have been lucky to get permission for 1 person to come. The fact that we got permission for 8 to come was because of CACID, because of academics. So academics, I mean, despite the government's apparent lack of interest in science and facts and data and that kind of thing, there is some kind of residual respect for academics. And I think you've got a real tool here. It makes you much stronger than you might think you are in terms of talking to authority on some of these issues.